it can be very difficult just from structural measures. If we could do one test that says, yes, there's glaucoma there and no, there's not, it would make our lives an awful lot easier. But so far, nobody's come up with one that does.
If you enjoy listening to this podcast with Lindsay, you may also like her lecture on improving the quality of visual field tests, which features in our practice team training program. The module is designed to educate clinical and non-clinical practice team members on why visual field testing is important, what can go wrong with the visual system, and how they can get the most accurate results from the test. The video is open to the whole practice team and is part of our practice team training program. Once you've watched the video, you can take a multiple choice question exam to consolidate your learnings. Go to optometry.co.uk/practice team training to take this exam or one of the 11 other modules we have available.
Welcome to the OT podcast, which takes a deep dive into the topics affecting optometry today. Each time we'll find a real expert in their field and attempt to pull everything we can out of their brain so it may reside in yours. This is the 18th episode in the series, and we are recording on Tuesday the 1st of July 2025. You can listen to the other episodes on the OT website, on Apple or Spotify, or from your usual podcast provider. In our 18th episode, we'll be speaking to Dr Lindsay Rountree. But first, my name's Kerry Smith-James. I'm the clinical multimedia editor at Optometry Today, and I'm also an optometrist in practice.
I'm Ian Beasley, Head of Education for the AOP, and also clinical editor of Optometry Today, and a visiting lecturer at Aston University. So, Kerry, before we welcome our guest, shall we take a look at what CPD we've got lined up in the coming weeks?
In terms of CPD video, we're going to be launching a video with Lorcan Butler, and that launches on the 6th of September. It's going to be all about headaches. Lorcan Butler works for the Brain Tumour Charity and is going to be giving us loads of interesting information about headaches and what to spot.
Great to have Lorcan involved, Kerry. I've heard him talk at a number of events, and his content is so valuable. It's good that we've got a video coming. I'd like to do a plug for Practice Team Day. So it's the first time that we're running this event, which will be online, Sunday, the 21st of September. And it's open for the entire practice team to join for free. So they can go to our events page, they can register as a non-member, and then they can benefit from the content that we've got to deliver that's pitched at a level that's suitable for the whole practice team. But also it's CPD accredited for optometrists and dispensing opticians. So we've got 4 interactive points on offer. Topics include how to navigate those clinical dilemmas that the practice team might face on the front line, how to avoid progressive lens non-tolerances, and a really interesting session from a child psychologist on communicating with children.
Sounds amazing.
So it's a pleasure to introduce Dr Lindsay Rountree, who's joining us today. Lindsay graduated from Cardiff University and qualified as an optometrist in 2007. She worked in independent clinical practice before returning to Cardiff, where she gained her PhD. Lindsay has been a clinical research optometrist at Aston University and is now at University of Bradford, where she leads the Masters in Optometry programme. Lindsay's research interests include glaucoma, mental health among optometrists, myopia management, ophthalmic public health, and contact lenses. Welcome, Lindsay.
You're right.
So you qualified in 2007, and then you went into practice for a while, and then you returned back to Cardiff to start your PhD. But if we just go back right to the beginning, what appealed to you about optometry, do you think, as a career?
I think when I was trying to decide what career I wanted to do, I ummed and ahed and went back and forth on a lot of different things, really. So I liked biology. I liked human biology. I knew I didn't want to be a doctor. Definitely that wasn't for me. And I looked at a lot of things that were sort of, I suppose, adjacent to that. So, no, I didn't want to be a dentist. I toyed with podiatry for a while. My cousin's a podiatrist, and so I talked to her a bit about it. I toyed with something a bit more general, like biomedical sciences. But as I suppose, like a lot of optometrists, at least of my generation, a lot of it came from the fact that I visited the optometrist a lot when I was a child. I'm very myopic, and I did a work placement with my optometrist when I was probably 16 and thought, I could probably do that. And I was particularly interested in the patients who come in and oh, this person's got high blood pressure and that's affecting their eyes for this reason, and sort of those types of things. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll go for optometry. But quite honestly, right up to sort of the UCAS form deadline, I still wasn't sure. And it wasn't until I started the course where I thought, oh, okay, maybe I can do this. Maybe this is the right choice.
And then you went into practice for a little while. And then your PhD, optimization of parametric stimuli for mapping changes in spatial summation in glaucoma. What does that mean?
It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, so in simple terms, what were you looking at throughout that?
So basically what I was looking at was the stimulus that we use in visual field testing. So that Goldman size 3 white stimulus on a white background. It was standardized whenever Goldman perimetry was invented, developed. And up until that point, there were various different methods of doing it and nothing was standardized. But that process of standardization happened before we really understood what glaucoma was and what it did and how the visual system added up all of this information. I mean, we still don't know that fully now, but we know much more about it than we used to. And so it was a bit of an arbitrary decision, a lot of this stuff. So Goldman came up with his 5 or 6 sizes, depending on whether you include Goldman size 0. And with the Goldman perimeter, it was the size that changed rather than the brightness typically. And then whenever people developed automated perimetry, when it became computerized, that process of changing the size and doing kinetic perimetry was actually really, really hard to do as something that was automated and something that was computerized. So it turned into what we now know as perimetry, this static perimetry, the spots that blink on and off, and the size stays the same. And really, the reason the size 3 was chosen was kind of because it was the middle one. It was, there was 1 to 5, and someone went, well, 3's in the middle. Let's pick that one. So it wasn't a particularly scientific choice, and there wasn't really anything that said it was the correct choice at the time. It's just the choice that was made. So my PhD was looking at whether we could take what we now know about how glaucoma changes the visual system. And spatial summation is to do with how the visual system sums together information over space, over area. My PhD was looking at whether we could kind of utilize that knowledge into parametric test, or at least it was one of the early stages of that anyway.
And does
that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense now. Even to me, it makes sense. That work's still ongoing, maybe by others, but has it informed?
It is
informed how designers approach equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another study that was done, I think, just after mine, which also looked at how, it's again, sort of bits started before, bits started after. There's been various work that's been ongoing in this. But another study looked at how glaucoma changes how the visual system adds up light over time. So there's over space and over time, which sounds a little bit Star Trek, but we're talking about the visual system here. So some work had been done that showed that, again, in glaucoma, that changes, how that sort of summing of information happens, whether a stimulus is, 60 milliseconds versus 200 milliseconds, that kind of thing. And then a study that happened after mine looked at whether that could, again, be utilized as part of perimetry. And yes, now the revamp study, which is a multi-center study across the UK, is looking at whether we can take all these bits of information together and actually put it into a perimeter and sort of make visual fields a little bit more scientific, I suppose, than perhaps they have been up to this point, or build on the scientific process anyway.
So do you think we're far from a product that's going to revolutionise perimetry?
I don't think we're far from a product, but there's always a challenge when you introduce a new product into optometry, well, into any medical field, I think. But, things have been attempted before with things like swap perimetry, with FDT. The challenge is always that it's very difficult to compare one directly to another. As soon as you change something like the background luminance, as soon as you change the size of a stimulus, as soon as you change the colour, it's not a like for like comparison. So you can't it's very hard to know then which one is better. And we've made this mistake before. We've certainly made this mistake with swap perimetry before, where whenever it sort of has been tested and we've looked at it from a research point of view, and it looks like it's better, but actually it's just that it's more variable, or it looks like it's better, but actually there's some false positives there. So it's saying there's defects when there's none present. It can be really easy to sort of jump on a bandwagon and not sort of test it properly. So you have to sort of take all of that into account whenever you're making these comparisons. The team that are doing the revamp study are largely the same team that were involved in my PhD as well. And that's something they're very, very careful with, is making sure that any comparisons that are made with existing technology are appropriate comparisons, that they're accounting for the fact that the platform is different. If you've got a perimeter where you're projecting a light and then you start putting it into something that's computerized with the back illuminated screen, all of that changes how the visual system sums that information, and just these like-for-like comparisons can be quite challenging. But I know that the revamp team are taking all of that into account. So I think the biggest challenge that is going to be faced there, once there's a product that exists, is simply that we're so used to our standard automated perimetry with our Goldman size 3. We've been using it for years and years and years. And then you bring along something new, that can be difficult because you've got, let's say you've been following a patient for 10 or 20 years. How do you start following them with a new piece of kit? So I think that's more likely to be the problem this time around. I think the science should be pretty sound.
In terms of the science, how do you feel as an academic? I think it was John Wilde that did a lot of the work in SWAP and spent years looking at this, only for it to perhaps become something of a blind alley. And I've faced that before with some of my own research, where you spend years collecting data and then only for the outcomes to be a little bit disappointing. How do you feel about that? Do you just take it on the chin and just accept that it's just research, and if you find a negative outcome, that's just as valuable as a positive outcome? It's often not viewed that way, but it ought to be.
Completely agree. A negative outcome is we've still learned something that doesn't work. And SWAP perimetry, just to be clear, SWAP is scientific. There is sound science behind it. And I certainly didn't mean to sort of make it sound like that wasn't the case. One of the biggest problems with SWAP is that you reduce the range of the instrument because you've got this bright background. And also it is really affected by things like cataract. And of course, most of the patients we're testing with visual fields do tend to be older and they do tend to have cataract. With SWAP, it's really scientific actually, but it just doesn't quite translate to a clinical setting. That's what makes it really hard. And then as well, there was the adaptation to the background that needed to happen. So it was a longer process. So that, just to be clear, that one did have quite a bit of science behind it, just didn't fully translate to clinical settings. And that's something I think that's always a challenge. The ideal quite often is something that just doesn't quite fit into a clinical setting, and you're always trying to find that balance. I think you're absolutely right. As researchers, we should be able to take it on the chin and accept that's just the way that it goes. But if you spent a lot of time working on something, you can't help but be a bit disheartened by it if it doesn't quite work the way you hoped it did. We're all human after all, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think I was paraphrasing John Wilde really there, where he seemed, maybe it's just how I interpreted it, but he just seemed a bit deflated by, doing all of this hard work and, as you say, very robust methodology to just discover that it's not quite what you hoped it would be.
Yeah.
But that's the game.
It is, yeah.
And is there a future where we can get rid of visual fields? Oh, I should wash my mouth out. That's an awful thing to say. But I love my OCT, and I love looking at structure. And visual fields gives me the information about function. Is there going to be a point where we can ditch this boring test that all the patients hate and everybody moans about? Can we see a future where we don't have to put people through it?
I think some people might tell you yes. They tend to be the people who research the OCT and structural tests more often. I think no, and simply that's because the structure-function relationship is really complicated, and for a number of different reasons. So you're looking at cells in the retina, and there's so many of them, and then there's all this kind of convergence of information all the way through the visual pathway to the visual cortex, which is the bit that does the processing and gives you the picture. So from the point of the retina all the way through to the visual cortex, there's all of this processing that's happening. So even in a perfect visual system, the structure-function relationship is hard to define because the center of the vision is going to be different than the periphery, whether you've got rods or cones at play. Even when you don't have glaucoma in the mix, actually the structure-function relationship is challenging, shall we say. And then you add into that the fact that there's a disease present, and disease does a number of things. So we know for a start that, or we know now, I should say, that ganglion cells don't just die, they go through a period of dysfunction, and that's hard to pick up on a structural measure because the cells are still there, just they may not be working 100%. And we also know then that this summing of information changes in glaucoma. That's sort of, again, kind of precursor to my PhD and to the revamp study. The way sort of the information gets gathered together changes in glaucoma. So that's very hard to, like, you can't really see that. That's something that's happening a little bit further down the pathway, we think. So I think the structure-function relationship is complicated anyway. And then you add into that things like just the normal variation that we see on a day-to-day basis. Like the optic disc looks completely different in different people, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're unhealthy. The number of ganglion cells somebody has is different in different people. And that, again, what's normal for one person isn't normal for another. So it can be very difficult just from structural measures. You know, we know this ourselves. If we could do one test that says, yes, there's glaucoma there and no, there's not, it would make our lives an awful lot easier. But so far, nobody's come up with one that does. And we know that while OCT is brilliant and gives us extra information about the ganglion cells and about the disc, it does give us false positives. It does tell us that somebody's got glaucoma when they don't. And those are probably on the people that we would really appreciate the extra help for, because it's the tilted discs and the myopic discs and the discs that just look a bit odd, aren't they? And those are the ones that we struggle to analyze, but it's also the ones that currently the machines struggle to analyze as well. One of the things you hear a lot about visual fields is that you have to lose a certain percentage of your ganglion cells before it will even show up on a visual field test. So, you know, sometimes it's at 20%, sometimes as much as 50%. You've got to lose 50% of your ganglion cells or it won't show up on a visual field test. This is something I came across during my PhD. I came across some of the studies that this fact or supposed fact comes from. And that isn't really what those studies showed at all. So often there would be cases where there's a comparison between glaucoma participants and healthy participants in terms of numbers of ganglion cells. But the tricky thing with that is that there is quite a bit of variation in the number of ganglion cells somebody has. So what is a normal number for one person might not be a normal number for another. And quite often the studies involved had quite small numbers of participants. So it was a tricky comparison to make anyway. But even then, when you have a look at the data doesn't say you must have lost 40%, 50% of your ganglion cells before it will show up on a field test. There are some examples of that, but there's also a lot of examples where that's not the case. And there's examples the other way around where actually there's a defect showing up on a visual field test, but actually, even according to the data in the study, it doesn't look like the person has lost many ganglion cells. And I think a lot of this is coming from variation. Sometimes it's coming from slight misrepresentation of the data, or there are some examples where maybe the statistics aren't quite right, things like that. But you do hear this amongst clinicians a lot. I definitely heard it on a number of occasions before I did my PhD. So I'm going to just bust that myth a little bit. It's not as straightforward as that. And actually the research, the data doesn't really support that statement. I also think it's worth remembering that at the end of the day, the thing that's important to the patient isn't the ganglion cells. The thing that's important to the patient is their vision. So it's just, I think, worth remembering that sort of end point as well, as it's the vision that's coming out at the end of it that's actually the important bit. So I certainly don't yet see, I don't know that we'll ever see a situation where we can just ignore the function of the visual system completely and just rely on these structural measures, because I think it's a really complicated system. And I think any attempts that have been made to model that, to say, okay, if this is what the retina looks like, or this bit of the retina, we can predict what the visual fields are going to be, have always struggled. You can predict some of it, but you can never predict all of it. And that's always a challenge, because you've got to treat a person as an individual, not just a probability, I suppose.
And that theme came through very strongly in a recent day of education that we ran called Glaucoma Day. And the webinars that were devoted to that topic all talked about those complexities and limitations of both functional and structural assessment. But there was one thing that was clear, was that about treating that patient as an individual, and in particular, monitoring change over time for those patients. So in terms of progression analysis, do you see the future changing very much there, particularly with artificial intelligence?
Possibly. I think artificial intelligence definitely has potential to help things, but it also has potential to make things a little bit worse. So I think it's something we do have to be careful with. I think the tricky thing with artificial intelligence in any capacity is knowing when to believe it and when not to believe it. I'm not sure if that's exactly the right way to put it. This might sound a bit arrogant, and I certainly don't mean it to, but because of the way we were taught and the way we were trained and the way we have approached clinical management of glaucoma, we haven't been using AI. We've been thinking about things a lot more. We've been adding together this information ourselves and trying to make these clinical judgments. I think there's a bit of a temptation to think that the computer knows more than you do. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think that is the difficult bit, is if you're learning now and you're relying on AI now, can you ever get to a point where you can use your clinical judgment in that same way, or have the confidence to disagree with a machine that says A and you perhaps think B, but you're not confident in that, so you don't go any further with that thought process. You just go, well, I must be wrong. And I think that's always the challenge, or I think it's the challenge anyway, with any type of AI. I think particularly with something like glaucoma, which is so complex, there isn't one test that's done. It is attempting to sort of bring all this information together. And, as we've said, the visual system is complex and it's not straightforward, and there is large variation in that. I think we have to retain our ability to think critically about these things and to think clinically about these things and not rely too much on what the computer thinks, because certainly at the moment, the computer is not always right.
That's something that resonates with me, actually, Lindsay, because I'm doing a master's in a subject completely away from optometry. So I'm learning that stuff from scratch. And I don't mind admitting that I do lean on AI to help explain difficult concepts. But then when I fact check that against evidence-based sources, it's clear that it does get stuff wrong. And it is a bit scary, as you say, if you just rely on artificial intelligence as the truth. It is pretty scary.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. It's a good starting point, and it can help to, as you say, explain things in quite a simple way, which is really good. But we do have to then fact check where the sources are from. And I think that's the tricky bit. We have to always remember, we're more so with big AI probably than with something that's visual field specific, but everything that's fed into it is considered equally, certainly at the moment, and everything that's being fed into it probably shouldn't be considered equally. That not everything that's being fed into it is correct or scientific. It's probably slightly better when we're talking about visual fields. There's a few more constraints of what actually goes into the models, but yeah, I think it is something that we have to be careful with, really.
And is that presenting challenges for you in teaching as well?
Yes, definitely. We're seeing an increased use in AI for sure. Optometry has always relied a little bit more on things like exams rather than coursework, because really as an optometrist, you need sort of a broad knowledge rather than deep knowledge, don't you? You need to know a lot of things rather than lots of things about one topic. It's sort of bits about lots of topics. So it's always relied more on, I suppose, a traditional exam setting. But we are definitely seeing even really little things like, I can tell whenever students used AI to write me an email, and that always sort of, and maybe this is my age showing, I always feel a little bit insulted by that. I would prefer that people just write me an email themselves, even if, perhaps not grammatically correct, but at least I have a better sense of what the student is thinking. I find that the way students, at least in optometry, are using AI, they're using it for, like I say, email writing or reflective writing, which sort of defeats the purpose a bit. So what you end up with is a lot of platitudes that don't really mean anything. There's no substance there. And I think that's something that we will have to be better at teaching, actually, is how to use AI for things like this. I think we've got to be quite careful. I think we need to teach our students things like don't put patient data into AI, because then that just becomes, there's a GDPR breach there, because you fed information into an engine that's going to keep that information and use it to make other decisions. Equally, we have to teach students not to necessarily believe what the AI says about that patient. And also, I think there are areas where AI can be helpful. Please don't get me wrong, but I think that's the challenge now, is teaching people how to use it responsibly and how to use it appropriately, and not just rely on it for everything. And certainly for something like reflective writing, it really defeats the purpose. So I wonder actually if that's something the GOC have seen as well. Have people just been doing their CPD reflections, stick it through AI, that'll do, chuck it in there, maybe with people not quite thinking that actually that isn't the point of the reflection. It's not just to write something that will get them a pass. It's actually to do a bit of thinking and, learn from our experiences.
When you did the practice team training video with us, you mentioned that you've got a lot more to say about visual fields. So as well as talking about things like virtual reality and forthcoming products and what's coming next, and I mean, do you want to just have a free-form rant about it?
I think most of what I spend my time saying, I guess, about visual fields is that it might feel old-fashioned, but it's still very relevant, and we can't get rid of our Humphreys quite yet, even though I know that some practices would like to. And, it's human nature. You'd like to get rid of the things that feel more subjective, they feel more variable. But we do have to remember that things like OCT can still be variable, even though we think that we are imaging in exactly the same way. It doesn't mean there's no variation there at all. And actually, in some ways, that variation can be useful. So there's decent research that suggests that some of the variability is disease, actually. We know that, for example, there's a higher number of false negatives in somebody with glaucoma doing a visual field test, not because they're not paying attention. We think it's part of the disease, actually, that there's variability in the visual system. So actually, although variation can be frustrating and it can make us sort of feel like we're not sure what to do, it actually might be information. It might be stuff that we need to know, and maybe we shouldn't be trying to get rid of all of it. I think the other thing, this is sort of more to things that I talk to undergrads about, is visual fields they tell you more than just the eye. They tell you loads of stuff about the visual system as a whole. And they're quite logical as well. Visual fields are a topic that seems to be not hated. I'm not sure if that's too strong a word. Disliked, we'll go with disliked, by a lot of people. But actually, they're quite logical, and it's pattern recognition. And, I guess that's coming back to maybe we just, I've got to be careful with pattern recognition, because that leads us back into AI again. And then it's very loopy, this conversation, isn't it? We're sort of ending up back at the same points again. That's part of the reason I think I like visual fields is that actually they are quite logical and we can learn a lot about it. And I'm certainly not suggesting that they're straightforward and easy. But yeah, I think most of what I tend to talk about is the fact that they're still relevant and that we can't get rid of them. And actually we should embrace them. Visual fields are a great test.
Yeah, I've had 2 patients this year already, which the only reason we knew they had brain tumours was because it showed on the visual fields. The eye looked perfectly okay, they just couldn't find anything else wrong.
Yeah.
But it showed up on visual field test.
I think a visual field test is a good test to do. The patients that come in with those symptoms that you can't put your finger on it, or you think, that's what it is. And then you test that and go, no, that's fine. There's nothing wrong. Their BV's completely normal. No, their prescription hasn't changed. They're insisting they're not seeing as well as they were, or their symptoms are just a bit odd or a bit vague. Stick them on a field screener. If nothing else, it'll just reassure you that you've done everything. Quite often, then something shows up and you go, oh, that's what's going on. That's why they say they can't see. There's something else there that I haven't been able to identify any other way.
And as you say, it's that reassurance, isn't it, of knowing that you've checked something that's looking from retina to cortex and all of the stuff in between.
Absolutely, yeah.
What I've noticed is that migraine sufferers tend to be particularly poor at doing visual fields, especially if they've had a migraine over the last few days. And I want to check their brain's okay, so I stick them on a visual field test. But they tend to be quite sort of... it looks like an unreliable result, but is that actually something caused by having a migraine? They tend to miss sort of random points all over the place.
That's interesting, actually. I don't know the literature associated with visual fields and migraines particularly well. I think it's worth just noting that. We do know, though, that if you got somebody who was actively having a migraine and stuck them in a visual field machine, not necessarily that would help their migraine, but they would have a defect. You know, their vision is affected, and it would show up on a visual field test. I think it's reasonable to assume, and this is an assumption, this is not based on research that I have done or I am aware of, but I think it would be reasonable to assume that doesn't just go away again straight away. I don't know if there's research into that. If there's not, it probably would be quite an interesting research topic. That's an interesting observation.
Over the years, it's just something that I've noticed. It's not quite cloverleaf, it's just random missed points. It might be a concentration thing because you just can't concentrate when you've had a migraine, you're in a bit of a weird phase.
Yeah, quite possibly.
If you enjoy listening to this podcast with Lindsay, you may also like her lecture on improving the quality of visual field tests, which features in our practice team training program. The module is designed to educate clinical and non-clinical practice team members on why visual field testing is important, what can go wrong with the visual system, and how they can get the most accurate results from the test. The video is open to the whole practice team and is part of our practice team training program. Once you've watched the video, you can take a multiple choice question exam to consolidate your learnings. Go to optometry.co.uk/practice team training to take this exam or one of the 11 other modules we have available.
So I noticed that you were a training lead for Women in Vision UK and involved in organising the conferences. Can you tell us a little bit about Women in Vision UK?
I can, yes. So I think it's fair to say that some people feel like organisations like Women in Vision UK aren't really necessary in this day and age, but that's not really been my experience, and I don't think it's been the experience of a lot of women working in the field. I think the temptation is to look at like undergraduate numbers and say, well, there's more women than men who are training as an undergraduate, so we've solved the gender problem there and let's just move on. But it's much more nuanced and much more complicated than that. Firstly, if you start looking through like leadership roles or academic roles or looking at ophthalmology, things like that, the gender split really swings the other way. And I'm always mindful that, whenever I was at school, and bearing in mind this was a while ago, but whenever I was at school and I was having a careers chat with one of my teachers and I said, I'm toying with optometry as a career, one of the first things she said, that's a great idea. It's a good career for a woman, which is an insane thing to say to somebody when they're 17 or at all, really. And I think we do need to get away from this idea that there are these, certain careers are good for a woman and certain careers are good for a man, because usually it's based on pseudoscience. It's based on, women are more empathetic or men are more, what's the word I'm looking for? I've lost it now. Analytical. Let's go with analytical. And all of that is, there's very good science that shows it's not as simple as that. These things are never as simple as that. It was my experience there that sort of led me to become involved with Women in Vision UK, because I thought, well, yes, actually, I do think that my career path, to a certain extent, at least up until that point, had been slightly skewed by that, because, at the age of 17, it didn't occur to me that was an odd thing to say to somebody, especially I would have been 2002, that should be something that I should have to consider. And I think that the process, the thought process behind it, I think, was around having a family and around having children, about how, it would be an optometry career would make it easier to work part-time or work around the children. But that, I don't believe, is something that should really be a thought process that I don't think it's something you should have to think about when you're deciding what your career should be. So when I found out that this existed, that this organisation existed, I thought I would quite like to get involved with that. And I will actually credit Sam Strong, who was in Women in Vision at the time, and I spoke to her about it. And I thought that it sounded like something I might like to get involved in. So really the idea behind it is to try and support women. It's women supporting women. It's a supportive network. We run things like webinars, we run a mentorship scheme, we have an annual conference, and it's really just a way for women to promote themselves, really. I think and I am going to generalize massively, so please excuse me, quite often women are less likely to put themselves forward for things. And this is to try and break away from that and get away from that a little bit. So I started as, I was an early career researcher lead. And then, yes, it moved into my role. My role was changed to be a training lead. And actually, it's just about to change again. So I'm now... well, we haven't yet worked out what we're going to call ourselves, but it's myself and Deanna Taylor, and we're going to be looking at how women in vision can help to support undergraduate optometrists. I do think there is a belief that because optometry is now shifting so that there's more women than men, at least training as optometrists, that this sort of gender split has been solved. But there are fewer women in leadership roles. There's fewer women who own their practices. There's fewer in managerial roles. There's fewer in academia. So it's maybe just looking at opening up some of those options and letting women see that it doesn't have to just be a 9-to-5 job necessarily. I think the flip side of this as well, though, is optometry is a very good career for a man. And that is part of what we're looking at as well. It isn't about saying that it's not just about looking at women's roles. As with all of these things, when you look at equality and diversity, if you improve the experience for one group of people, quite often you improve the experience for everybody, because there shouldn't be these splits with gender or sexuality or disability. These playing fields should be a little bit more level, and we should be encouraging everyone rather than trying to steer people into one route or another.
So is this something that our listeners can get involved with?
Absolutely. I will admit that our website could do with a little bit of a revamp. It's something that we are looking at the moment, but we do have a website, womeninvision.co.uk. It is an organisation that's open to it's open to everyone. You actually don't have to be a woman to sign up for it. We do have men who are involved. We do have other genders as well. And it's open to everyone who works in vision science, whether you're an optometrist, an ophthalmologist, an orthoptist, whether you're a vision scientist. We've got psychologists on there who work in vision science. We've got nurses who work in vision science. It's open to everybody, really. And it is designed to be inclusive and supportive. And it's designed to help people, I suppose, to get to where they want to be, I guess. The conference in particularly is something that we find works very well. So we always make a point of having, female keynotes. We have panel discussions. We have early career sections as well. A little bit of a sneak preview. We're hoping that at this year's conference, we're going to talk a little bit about allyship. So it's not about women in a vacuum. It's not about, we can promote ourselves to ourselves all we want, but it needs to be broader than that, so that there's a bit there as well about male allyship and really just not pigeonholing people, I suppose.
Just on that note, I've been reviewing feedback this morning from 100% Optical 2025, and we had a session on allyship by, I think it was Evelyn Mensah.
Oh, yes. Evie's lovely.
Feedback for that session was wonderful. And while on the topic of 100% Optical, we have provided a platform in the past for Women in Vision UK for a couple of years, where we've invited early career researchers to be part of that event. So perhaps that's a thread that we can pick up, Lindsay, for ahead of planning for 2026, because it would be
fantastic.
It'd be great. I think I've dropped the ball on that in the past couple of years, so I need to pick that back up.
It's easy. There's so many threads going on at the moment in all sorts of places, and we find this ourselves, actually, the committee, where suddenly we go, oh, we had this great idea last year and we never followed on with it. So yeah, sometimes it's just the momentum keeping that going a little bit. But yeah, that would be brilliant. Let's have a chat about that.
And do you currently know when the next conference is going to be and where it's going to be held?
The Women in Vision UK conference this year will be held on Friday the 21st of November, and it will be at City St George's in London. So keep an eye out. There's going to be information coming out about abstract submission, the wider programme and things like that pretty soon. So I can't give an exact date for when that will be made available, but I would expect it to be made available, I think, in July.
Great.
And we should also mention that the current issue of Optometry Today, which landed on the 2nd of August, is all about women in optometry.
Lindsay, just moving away from visual fields, you've got your fingers, or had your fingers, in more than one pie. So you cover several research areas. So I think myopia management and mental health and ophthalmic public health, contact lens research. How are you juggling all of those plates, and which of those plates are currently spinning?
I definitely feel like sometimes the answer to that question is badly. I'm not juggling those plates as well as I should be. Although I started my research in visual fields, I do definitely have quite a variety of things on the go for sure. The ones that are probably most prominent at the moment. So you mentioned mental health and well-being amongst optometrists. That's a big one at the moment. And another of my PhD students is currently looking at how glaucoma changes vision, because that's something we know surprisingly little about. So her research has been fascinating, actually. And then the other sort of big thing that's taking my time at the moment is actually an extension of Women in Vision UK. I'm part of a British Council grant that is attempting to set up a similar network in Ghana. So we have links with the University of Cape Coast there, a fantastic woman called Dilys Omega, who is sort of spearheading that, and hopefully heading out to Ghana in a few weeks to take part in their inaugural conference as well. So that's pretty exciting. So those are probably the things I'm most involved with at the moment.
Lindsay, just thinking about stuff that you're doing at Bradford outside of research, of course, you've got that role of leading the Masters in Optometry programme. And the three of us are old enough to remember the traditional BSc pre-reg route. And now we've got this reimagined route to qualification. Does that feel different but the same?
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it, actually. Different but the same. And, although we say that we've revamped the whole thing, the eye hasn't changed. And we can't say that clinical practice has changed drastically in the last couple of years. Yes, it's changed since sort of the BSc was designed, I suppose. It's been a good opportunity to have a look at how we teach and what we're doing, and maybe putting the emphasis in slightly different places. We are coming up against some of the same problems we always do. We always get students who come in who perhaps think the course is slightly different than it is. A little bit like my own experience. I think you don't really know if it's the course for you until you start to do it. It's not like it's a school subject that you're just extending. And I think sometimes, although we emphasize the theory, the bit that people quite often aren't sure about is the interaction with other people. And really, again, until you start to do that, I think you don't know whether it's for you or not. So all of that is the same. That element hasn't really changed at all. Our biggest challenge is just trying to juggle the two, really. We've got this year, our second year and our third years are on the BSc. Our first years are on the Masters. That will obviously change as the years go on, but you also have students who will need to resit some years. So we're going to be juggling these two programs side by side for a little while, which is always hard, but particularly hard at the moment because higher education is struggling, and the University of Bradford in particular is struggling. I could go off on a rant about that for a while, but you probably don't want that in your podcast.
How is university struggling? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
It goes way back to whenever higher education was government funded, and it's not government funded anymore, but that doesn't mean that universities have had this big injection of cash. So tuition fees are much higher than they were certainly when I was a university student. But that doesn't mean that the universities are making more money. It's just that they're not subsidized the way they used to be. And those tuition fees have stayed the same for however many years it is, but everything else has got more expensive. And there is a financial crisis going on in higher education, and some universities have been hit harder than others. University of Bradford is not doing particularly well. The optometry program is a program that students are always interested in. We don't have a shortage of students, that's not the problem, but we need the financial backing to support staff to teach that, which we don't fully have at the moment. If you don't have enough staff, you can't run the course properly. And this is a course, it's not... The challenge we always find is trying to explain to people who don't have the experience of optometry. You can't just stick 10 extra students into a lecture theatre and that's fine. It's all the practical element, isn't it? It's such a hands-on course. It's such a practical course. You need to be able to teach that in small enough groups that, students don't fall through the gaps. They get what's going on, but you also need to have the staff to support that. And that is a bit of a challenge at the moment for sure. Our university is currently facing redundancies, and we've lost staff over the past couple of years, which has made it really, really hard to run the programme. And if we lose any more, honestly, I don't know what we'll do.
Okay, it's pretty bleak, isn't it, really? But
yeah.
As you say, what is the solution? So, Lindsay, as we look to wrap things up, perhaps the most intriguing question on our list is that rumour has it you're a member of a fairly exclusive club, and you might not even be able to talk about it. Can you tell us more about the Ling Long tour?
I had no idea where you were going with that. I can confirm that I'm a member of a secret society known as Ling Long Tours. Right, so, okay, the history of this was before my time. I'm not 100% sure of some of it, but basically this is a group of colleagues that go hiking once a year on one of the Maybank holidays. I'm not 100% sure how exactly it started. I've heard probably these things usually do. Ling Long is a reference to Chris Longley, and I believe the Ling Long nickname comes from a student who called him Dr Ling Long one day, and that just stuck amongst us anyway. So every year he organises a place for us to go. So we were in the Yorkshire Dales this year. We go on 2 hikes, so one on the Sunday and one on the Bank Holiday Monday. And it's really good. It's a really nice way to sort of connect with colleagues outside of a work setting. It's healthy. We're out walking. What's less healthy is sort of the beer and curry that tends to come afterwards. But certainly from a sort of mental health point of view, it's great. I really enjoy it. It's good fun. People tend to bring partners as well, so it's just a nice sort of social atmosphere, really.
Yeah, I see it across social media platforms at that time of year, and it's always intrigued me a bit. So
we did learn last year that, not sure whether to put this in the podcast, but I will anyway. We did learn last year that Chris Davies should not be in charge of organising any of the walks because we got stuck up a mountain.
Definitely keeping that in.
Yeah, he said that it was a short walk and we would be done by lunchtime. This was the Bank Holiday Monday, and 6 hours later we finally got down the mountain. We hadn't brought enough food because we thought we'd be done by lunchtime. This is not how to prepare for any hike, by the way. And we realised that we had accidentally climbed the 4th and 5th highest mountains in Wales. So he's not allowed to plan any of the walks anymore.
Seems fair. Lindsay, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. It's been really, really enjoyable chatting to you about all sorts of things.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks so much. It's been, I knew you'd be a great guest.
Thank you.
Just before I go, I can only get to this end of the 6-9 line on your chart behind you, so pay attention to what
it says. Pay attention to what Lindsay is saying.
Oh, I did for an hour. Great.
If you enjoy listening to this podcast with Lindsay, you may also like her lecture on improving the quality of visual field tests, which features in our practice team training program. The module is designed to educate clinical and non-clinical practice team members on why visual field testing is important, what can go wrong with the visual system, and how they can get the most accurate results from the test. The video is open to the whole practice team and is part of our practice team training program. Once you've watched the video, you can take a multiple choice question exam to consolidate your learnings. Go to optometry.co.uk/practice team training to take this exam or one of the 11 other modules we have available.